Hello. I want to talk a little bit about the article, Do This in Remembrance of Me, an African Feminist Contestation of the Embodied Sacred Liturgical Space in the Celebration of the Eucharist by Lilian Siwila. Something I want to kind of preface as you think through this scholarship. This author is applying what she self-discloses as an African feminist perspective. Now, that can be a lot of different things, but I want to sort of give the broadest definition of feminist, where a lot of us have assumptions, definitions that we might think of, but in many ways, there's a lot of diversity within feminist thought. And the most basic common denominator is really just a commitment to women's experiences and women's flourishing. Now, what women's flourishing looks like, again, we're going to see a variety of opinions, but really someone who refers to herself or himself as a feminist is someone who pays attention to the stories, experiences of girls, women, etc. In many ways, anytime someone approaches the Bible, but it could be another text, we do so from a variety of perspectives. In biblical scholarship, we use this fancy term called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, you might notice the beginning of that word, Hermes, as in Greek mythology, the god of messages. He's the messenger god. So hermeneutics is all about how is a message delivered. So there's a variety of approaches, methodologies, frameworks. And so to think about one of these lenses, I really like to imagine an art metaphor where if, let's say there's a painting and it's a very colorful bouquet, right? So lots of different colorful flowers. The frame actually influences the way we see the artwork. So the artwork seems to change, even though the artwork is always the same, the actual picture draws attention to different components depending on the frame. So if I use a red frame, that might draw my eye towards the red roses. If I have a green frame, that might draw my attention to the stem, the leaves, etc. So a hermeneutic is about attention. It's not about necessarily saying this perspective is more important than another, or this is a more correct view. It's just about what do you want to focus on? Because we're just human, we're finite, we can't focus on everything at once. So sometimes it's helpful to compartmentalize. So in class, we've been looking at biblical text through historical perspectives, right? Considering the historical context of the author, and then imagining how it applies to a different historical context, like the present. We've been using literary hermeneutics. So looking at how literary devices draw our attention and seem to indicate some special meaning by the fact that something might have a parallel or kind of a sandwich, etc. And so in addition to feminist perspectives, you could look at it through the lens of masculinity studies. What is being taught? What is being projected in terms of perpetuating or creating a sense of manhood? We could also look at it through the perspective of different groups of people on the planet, whether it's through migration. So someone who is a transient person, or someone, whether it's sort of forced expulsion, seeking refuge, looking for new opportunities. So we could also pay attention to the passages in the Bible that have to do with travel and displacement. And then another really important lens that is really popular with modern biblical scholarship is post-colonial. So post in general tends to mean after, right? Post this. So in that more like political sense, we do think about nations and what they look like post-colonization, right after they have gained political independence. And yet, even with political independence, the economic entanglement, the mental, cultural value structures are still often tied to this previous life, to these previous establishments that have already had a chance to have, whether it's economic roots, et cetera. So post-colonial isn't really thinking about the after so much as the full dynamic makeup of like power structures. So to read the Bible from a post-colonial perspective is a commitment to focus on power dynamics. Who seems to have more of it? Who seems to have less of it? What is the source of influence? What is the source of someone's ability to exert control and even oppress? So we're looking at this binary of oppressed oppressor, and yet it's not really a clean-cut binary. There's a fluidity where people who inflict harm can also be a victim in times, and people who are often victims can also perpetuate violence. So it's something that is a moving target. And it's something to really think about Jesus through, because he's living in colonized, occupied homeland by the Romans, right? The Romans are occupying Israel. And then also, Jesus seems to have his own sorts of opinions and assumptions in terms of other ethnic groups. So we're going to see that in other stories with how Jesus engages with a Syrophoenician woman. We see it with a Samaritan, and I'll speak more about Samaritans later. But for this particular article, again, we're going to think through this author's African perspective. It's important to note that when she's referring to her African lens, it's rooted in her particular experience. It's not meant to be then mapped on to all types of African experience. So I hope that goes without saying. So I want to take us through a little bit of the article, if you want to follow along. In the introduction, right off the bat, she discloses that she's invested in gendered space and the power dynamics, and particularly how that applies to the Eucharistic table. And she asks some pretty poignant questions. Who is eligible to participate at the Lord's table? And participate in what ways? What are the different options? And that this is sacred space, this is God's table. So what does it look like for humans to patrol the borders, even like the literal, there's often a border of who can access, approach, and receive God's grace, who gets to experience God's love in a visceral way. So for Lilian, she's going to connect table fellowship to her popular concepts of table fellowship available to her in her African context, where sharing a meal is kind of a lively essence of community, that no real event is complete without breaking bread together. And so that it's so central to a group's identity and nourishment. We can see how the Eucharist would lend itself. She does go through a very quick, right? She says a brief history of the liturgy. And I do think it's important to note that the liturgies we have quote the Bible, right? The liturgy quotes different parts of the Bible, but the liturgy that we've inherited is not given to us in the context of the New Testament. So these are artistic, spiritual creations produced mostly by the early fathers, right? The patristics, pater, and that have kind of evolved or changed over time. And that in many ways, the goal of these liturgies is to sum up salvation history and in really powerful cross-textual ways, but it also can sometimes be misleading when we're constantly taking out lines from different books of the Bible, almost separating it from the context of the entire book and almost mishmashing it into a different voice, which is a faithful endeavor. We just have to be cautious. And then she proposes something about round table theory. Now, in a round table, there is no spot really that is automatically interpreted as the head, the person in charge, right? With a rectangle, you can say, oh, the leaders are at the head of the table. So there's some sort of sense of hierarchy, whereas a round table does its best to diminish hierarchies, that it sort of aspires for equality. We could further critique table theory because is the table big enough? Is the table inclusive enough? Who is serving the table? Who's not at the table? As we'll see with the Syrophoenician woman story, who's under the table. But in general, round table is celebrating an atmosphere of hospitality, right? Of this mutuality of I respect you. We want to be in the fold together. She also wants to discuss the ways in which hospitality or meal sharing in many different cultures throughout history have been microcosms for the ways in which larger society operates, right? We can sort of see the macro condensed in this micro experience, how power is negotiated, how it's performed, how is graciousness performed, but how is exclusion played out, right? Who's not invited? Who doesn't know the codes? Who doesn't know the mannerisms, the etiquette, right? So this is almost like an etiquette class, and all of that has cultural weight and social weight. And it's peculiar, this idea that Christians live in between this God of all that's wildly inclusive, and yet because of baptism, because of these other exclusionary practices, it becomes quickly clear who's in, who's out. So how do we go between that? And she really wants to imagine how sharing a meal can have the potential to break down these social barriers. So she's looking at passages where Jesus also breaks down social barriers. So further going on in her discourse, she's going to locate her analysis in Tonga ethnic group that talks about meals, enshrining codes. It's a bunch of transactions, and it's where people learn about their belonging. And this is not exclusive to African experiences by any stretch of the imagination, right? Like we could pretty much say all cultures have meal rituals, have meals we all have to eat. So as we're going into Thanksgiving, maybe we're not able to meet with as many family members this year, but from memory, who's had the kids table, who's had the adults table. Do you just sort of sneak into the adults table over time? Is there sort of a formal age that you're now welcomed? Do you have to meet certain sort of mature criteria? So again, we're seeing how people create groups based off of these other markers. And she also talks about how table fellowship is seeking a unity without uniformity. So unity does not mean sameness. Unity does not mean we have to be homogenous. We all have to kind of act exactly the same and have the same role. And that's something that's also stressed in Catholic tradition, this idea of different people having different roles, but still equally meaningful, equally powerful. And we can say that, but then we have to see if in practice, that's how it's actually treated. We can say, oh, the ministry of the lay person, the ministry of the brother, they're equally valid. They're not uniform, but there's unity. And yet, in practice, whose ministries tend to be valued more? So we kind of say one thing, but mentally, we often reinscribe these hierarchies. So we have to be really careful. When is it just lip service? And when is it really lived out in charity? She also talks about this idea of a safe space. And this is something that comes up in a lot of, whether it's the classroom, whether it's a church community, whether it's, an office, who is safe and who gets to be uncomfortable is really fraught. And in many ways, we have to take this approach of, again, thinking about power dynamics and who can sort of afford to ignore or step outside or leave situations that make us uncomfortable, versus a lot of people where they don't have that privilege of kind of leaving uncomfortable situations. And in many ways, we have to think about, who do we want the space to be safe for? Who seems to be more vulnerable or afflicted in a community because of previous, whether it's like value systems or structures that have sort of forced the hand of people to constantly experience prejudice. So in many ways, in order to make it safe, some other people might have to become more uncomfortable than they're used to in order to make it truly safe for the larger group. In many ways, Jesus kind of says this throughout the New Testament. Christ did not come to share the same news with every group of people in a way. We see a lot of, like, if you just look at the Beatitudes, there's different pronouncements for those who are wealthy versus those who are poor. If you look at Luke, it'll say, woe to those who are wealthy, woe to those who laugh, right? Like, I'm implicated. Woe to those who are full, right? I'm implicated again. So it seems that Jesus does come to comfort the afflicted, but there's also a little bit of Jesus comes to afflict the comforted. And so we shouldn't ever be like too easy and think of Jesus as too tame. So again, how is that safe space actually nurtured in our meals? She also, of course, wants to pay attention to women's presence. Was there a woman at the Last Supper? Was Mary there? She's mentioned. How is this justification for women's exclusion from the table? Now, traditionally, the larger exclusion of women from the Lord's Supper has been used to justify why she can't kind of celebrate over the meal. But you could also use that same logic and say, if women weren't present at the Last Supper, then maybe women shouldn't receive Eucharist at all, right? So we use these logics, and we just have to see how the same logic could be applied to a different situation, and yet we don't seem to maintain the conclusion in a different sphere, but we keep like a conclusion in this space. So it's fascinating, and we have to pay attention. She also talks about physical capacity in general, that not only are certain bodies feminized, but in particularly disabled bodies are feminized. And in fact, often women seem to be treated socially, not to, right? I don't want to totally conflate ability studies with with women's experiences, but who's treated as if they're lacking the right parts or lacking some sort of capacity to do these other ministries, right? Are you physically disenfranchised, right? Is that sort of the mentality? And we can even see this with architecture, right? Or even in the academy. So like going off to colleges, and if I've, going to certain conference rooms, or even conference rooms today at like major corporations, a lot of the chairs, like the chairs themselves, are just designed for taller, bigger people, right? So yes, there's super tall women, and yes, there are smaller men. But in general, when we have spaces, like even at the altar, where the altar is very tall, it starts to seem to indicate who can literally even reach it. So architecture speaks, architecture ends up feeling gendered, and it communicates values, it communicates who's supposed to stand here and who's not, for better or for worse, right? If you keep going on, speaking of this altar word, it has so much formality and grandeur and sacredness to just this word alone. But she almost challenges us to rethink again about the altar space as a table, to kind of get it back into this banquet mode of celebration, where this is a dining table where we're just in this kind of love feast with Christ, versus the altar seems to transition it into a space more of power. So some other great questions she asks as you read on in the article goes back to what actually happened at the meal. And this becomes an opportunity to think about what we replicate. So we saw this with baptism. What did Jesus do? He was fully immersed. It was in running water. What do we have to replicate from this original story? Oh, we just have to preserve water. But is that an arbitrary decision? Same thing with Eucharist. What do we have to replicate that was a part of this original scene? So Jesus has one cup, one bread. And symbolically at our Mass, we do talk about this one chalice. But we often have more than one chalice, right? For practical reasons, for it to go around. So we translate these stories into our modern concerns, but are we actually being told to just have one chalice? That's something we'll explore in class. The same thing with Jesus's words, where he says, drink this, and yet half of us intinct, right? It doesn't say like intinct, it says drink. So are we missing out if we don't kind of replicate those motions? Or is it actually kind of exciting that the Catholic Church allows us to veer off from the original story and do these other practices? So if the Church is already saying we can stray from the original story, where else can we continue to stray but still retain Jesus's message of love, celebration? Continuing to go through her article, she brings up a lot of ideas we've already discussed in class, particularly attitudes of the flesh, how often the flesh has been devalued because of the dualistic understanding that spirit is so much more superior than the flesh. And yet precisely for Roman understanding, the flesh and the incarnation is so real and crucial to our spiritual sense of self, our spiritual sense of hope. And this is where she's going to continue on with reading through the Gospel of Mark. So we've looked at a lot of these stories, again, bringing up the hemorrhaging woman, who is an ostracized woman. And like the text says, she's a Samaritan. We didn't really discuss this in class. Samaritan is a term we've seen in other places in the New Testament. You might be familiar with the most famous story of the Good Samaritan. And the irony is, a Samaritan is actually pretty similar to an Israelite. Yes, they're more located in the region of Samaria versus Jew, who is from Judea, right? Jew is not really a religious term at first, but more of a geographical marker. So we see geographical differences, but in the realm of spirituality, Samaritans also followed the Torah. So they also believed in Yahweh. They also believed in the monotheistic God. What seemed so offensive to Israelites about Samaritans is that Samaritans rejected the rest of the Tanakh. So the Torah is Bible, but not the histories, not the prophets, not the Psalms, all of that material. So we have this situation where the people who seem to annoy us the most are the ones who are actually the closest to us, right? It's like we can almost get along better with people who are really, really different than we can get along with people who are like us, but just not enough. So that's what's playing into the animosity and the kind of the scoffing of the Samaritans actually doing a good thing. And what's also provocative about the New Testament and perspectives on Samaritans is there is another story where Jesus heals 10 lepers, Samaritans, and tells them, now that you're healed, go to your temple and thank God. So they had a different temple in Mount Gerizim in the north. In other words, Jesus is not telling them to go to Jerusalem. So this would have been very politically, religiously charged. You're undermining the ultimate temple, capital T. Like, you're not telling them to go to our priests, our temple, but you're saying their little fringe temple that doesn't even have the full story correct, they get to go there and their priests can verify them, is quite provocative. That, you know, Jesus almost seems to kind of allow people to work within their systems and meet God within their systems. Who knows? And maybe you can bring those questions into your interreligious meditations. So all of this is to say, with all of these different components, Lilian is wanting to talk about how we humanize or dehumanize groups, how we might claim that we're not actually dehumanizing them, but if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, like if people still feel ostracized, you know, what's the reality? So in many ways, it's really the person who's the target, the one who incurs the insults, incurs the shame, incurs the violence, who really gets to judge whether something is offensive or not in that realm. So I hope this helps to kind of ground, you know, your perspectives as you go through this article. And then, as always, just email me if you have any questions.